What happens when Hollywood's brightest young star refuses to play by the rules of late-night television? The studio lights were blazing, the audience was buzzing with anticipation, and Jimmy Kimmel was ready for what should have been another routine celebrity interview. But when Bella Ramsey walked onto that stage, something was different. The tension in the air was palpable, and what unfolded over the next 20 minutes would become one of the most shocking moments in late-night history. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below about your thoughts on celebrity interviews gone wrong. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The warm-up comedian had just finished getting the crowd energized, and the band was playing Bella's Walk on music. As the young actor emerged from behind the curtain, the audience erupted in applause. Fresh off the massive success of The Last of Us, Bella had become one of the most sought-after interviews in Hollywood. But those who knew Bella well could see something was off from the moment they sat down. Jimmy launched into his typical opening banter, but his first question immediately struck a nerve. So, Bella, must be quite the adjustment going from British television to American stardom. Do you find yourself having to dumb things down for American audiences? The smile that had been on Bella's face moments before vanished instantly. They shifted in their seat, their jaw tightening visibly. I'm sorry, did you just ask if I have to dumb things down? Jimmy, seemingly oblivious to the shift in energy, laughed it off. Well, British humor can be a bit sophisticated for some folks over here. That's an interesting way to start an interview, Bella responded, their voice steady but with an unmistakable edge. Insulting an entire country's intelligence. The audience grew quiet, sensing the unexpected tension. Jimmy tried to pivot, but the damage was already beginning to show. Oh, come on, I'm just having a bit of fun. That's what we do here. Is it, though? Bella leaned forward slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're perpetuating tired stereotypes while hiding behind the excuse of comedy. Jimmy's face reddened slightly, his trademark grin faltering. This wasn't going according to script. He glanced at his cards, trying to find a way to regain control of the interview. Well, speaking of The Last of Us, let's talk about that. Must have been quite physical, all that running from zombies. They're not zombies, Bella corrected firmly. They're infected. There's a significant difference, which you'd know if you'd actually watched the show. The host's laugh now sounded forced. Of course, infected. My mistake. Though I have to say, for someone so young, you seem awfully serious about everything. And there it is, Bella said, shaking their head. The age thing. Tell me, Jimmy, would you say that to Tom Holland, to Timothée Chalamet? Or is it just easier to patronize someone you perceive as different? The studio audience was now completely silent, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The band leader looked between Jimmy and the producers, unsure whether to play some transitional music. Jimmy's face had gone from red to slightly pale, his cards now forgotten in his lap. I think you're reading too much into this, Bella. We're just having a conversation here. No, Bella interrupted. You're following a script designed to get laughs at my expense. There's a difference between genuine conversation and whatever this is. Jimmy attempted another redirect. Let's talk about your upcoming projects then. I heard you're working on something new? Are you actually interested, or is this just another setup for a punchline about my appearance or my identity? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy's mouth opened and closed, resembling a fish out of water. This was clearly not the sweet, malleable young star he had expected. The producers in the control room were frantically gesturing, some making cutting motions across their throats, others pointing at the commercial break button. I'm genuinely interested, Jimmy said, though his tone suggested otherwise. That's why you're here, to promote your work. Is it? Bella's voice was calm but cutting. Because so far, all you've done is make backhanded comments and treat me like a novelty act rather than a serious actor. I came here expecting a professional interview, not to be the punchline of your monologue. Jimmy's professional veneer was cracking. His fingers drummed nervously on his desk, a tell that regular viewers would recognize as a sign of his growing agitation. Look, if you can't handle a little friendly banter, maybe you're not ready for the big leagues. The gasp from the audience was audible. Bella's eyes narrowed, and they sat up straighter in their chair. Friendly banter, is that what you call questioning my professionalism and making snide remarks about my nationality and age? You're being overly sensitive, Jimmy shot back, abandoning any pretense of the jovial host. This is how these shows work. We make jokes. We have fun. We don't take everything so seriously. No, Bella countered, their voice rising slightly, for the first time. This is how your show works. You bring on guests, particularly young ones, particularly women and non-binary people, and you chip away at them with these little comments disguised as humor. And when they push back, you gaslight them by calling them sensitive. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Jimmy's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of his desk, his carefully constructed persona of the affable, late-night host completely shattered. The audience members were exchanging worried glances, some pulling out their phones despite the strict no-recording policy, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. You know what, Bella? Jimmy's voice had dropped to a lower register, abandoning any pretense of friendliness. Maybe the problem isn't my show. Maybe the problem is that you came here with an agenda, looking for a fight. Bella actually laughed at this, but it wasn't a sound of amusement. An agenda. My agenda was to talk about my work, to connect with fans, to have a meaningful conversation about art and storytelling. Your agenda seems to be reducing every guest to their most superficial characteristics for cheap laughs. That's rich, Jimmy snapped, his professional composure completely gone now. Coming from someone who's built their entire career on being different, on standing out. You can't have it both ways, Bella. You can't demand to be seen as special, and then get upset when people notice what makes you different. The audience audibly reacted to this, some with sharp intakes of breath, others with murmurs of discomfort. Bella's expression hardened, their hands clenched in their lap. There's a difference between acknowledging someone's identity and using it as ammunition for your comedy routine. The fact that you can't see that distinction says everything about why your ratings have been declining. Jimmy's face flushed deep red. My ratings are just fine. Thank you very much. Maybe if you spent less time on your high horse and more time being entertaining, you'd understand how this business actually works. Oh, I understand how it works, Bella fired back. It works by exploiting young talent, by turning genuine human experiences into punchlines, by maintaining the status quo instead of challenging it. And when someone refuses to play along, you try to put them in their place. The band leader was now openly staring at the producers, who were making frantic gestures from behind the cameras. The typical 7-minute segment had already stretched to 15 minutes, and there was no sign of this confrontation cooling down. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing at his lips. You think you're so enlightened, don't you? Coming on my show, and lecturing me about how to do my job. You've been in this industry for, what, 5 minutes? And you think you know better than everyone else? I know better than to treat people like props for my ego, Bella responded without missing a beat. I know better than to hide cruelty behind comedy. And I certainly know better than to punch down at guests who are half my age. Punch down! Jimmy's voice was incredulous. You're one of the highest-paid young actors in Hollywood right now. You're hardly some victim here. This isn't about me being a victim, Bella said firmly. This is about calling out behavior that has gone unchecked for too long. How many young actors have sat in this chair and smiled through your condescension because they were afraid it would hurt their careers? How many have left feeling smaller than when they arrived? Jimmy stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. The sudden movement caused the audience to tense, unsure of what was about to happen. You want to know what I think? I think you're an entitled, ungrateful brat who doesn't appreciate the platform you've been given. Bella stood as well, matching his energy but maintaining their composure. And I think you're a dinosaur who's confused longevity with relevance. Just because you've been doing this for years doesn't mean you've been doing it well. The two stood facing each other across the desk, the space between them charged with animosity. The studio lights seemed harsher now, casting stark shadows across their faces. Security personnel had moved closer to the stage, ready to intervene if necessary. "You're done here," Jimmy said, his voice low and threatening. "Get off my stage." "Gladly," Bella replied, but they didn't move. "But first, let me say something to your audience, since you clearly won't give me the chance to do it properly." They turned to face the cameras directly, ignoring Jimmy's sputtering protests. "To anyone watching this, remember that you don't have to accept disrespect disguised as humor. You don't have to smile when someone diminishes you for entertainment. Your voice matters, your boundaries matter, and anyone who tells you otherwise is more interested in their own power than in genuine connection." "Security!" Jimmy barked, his face now purple with rage. "Get them out of here!" But Bella was already walking toward the exit, their head held high. As they reached the curtain, they turned back one more time. "Oh, and Jimmy, your writers called earlier. They wanted me to tell you that the jokes you rejected for being too mean-spirited were actually the kindest ones they had." The studio erupted in chaos. Some audience members were applauding, others sat in stunned silence. Jimmy was shouting at his producers, demanding to know how this had been allowed to happen. The band struck up an awkward musical transition as the show cut to commercial, but not before cameras caught Jimmy sweeping his cards off the desk in frustration. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Crew members whispered in corners, some expressing shock at what they'd witnessed, others quietly admitting that they'd seen this side of Jimmy before, but never so publicly exposed. Bella's publicist was fielding frantic calls, while social media was already exploding with clips and reactions from audience members who had managed to record portions of the confrontation despite the ban. "This is a disaster," one producer was overheard saying. "How do we even come back from this?" But for Bella, walking through those backstage corridors, there was no regret. They had spoken truth to power in a way that few had dared to do before. The consequences would come, certainly, but in that moment, they felt the satisfaction of someone who had refused to be diminished. The commercial break was supposed to last 3 minutes, but it stretched to nearly 10 as the production team scrambled to figure out how to salvage the remainder of the show. In the control room, phones were ringing off the hook. Network executives were being patched in via emergency conference calls, and Jimmy could be heard through the walls, his voice raised in fury as he berated anyone within earshot. When the show finally returned from break, Jimmy was back at his desk, but his tie was loosened and his face still carried the flush of anger. The audience, many of whom had been asked to leave during the break, while others were begged to stay, sat in uncomfortable silence. The energy in the room was completely different from the usual late-night revelry. "Well," Jimmy began, his voice strained as he attempted to regain his composure. "Sometimes in live television, things don't go as planned." He forced a laugh that fooled no one. "Our scheduled guest had to leave due to creative differences, but the show must go on." From the wings, Bella hadn't actually left the building yet. They stood with their publicist and a growing group of crew members who had quietly gathered to show their support. Through the monitors, they watched as Jimmy tried to spin the narrative. You know, when you've been in this business as long as I have, Jimmy continued, his words carefully measured, but the anger still simmering beneath. You meet all types. Some people understand the give and take of entertainment, and others think they're above it all. On stage, Jimmy was warming to his theme, the audience's silence emboldening rather than deterring him. The thing about this new generation is they want all the benefits of fame without any of the work. They want to be celebrated without being challenged, praised without being questioned. They call it boundaries. I call it being precious. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, and a few could be seen getting up to leave despite the usher's attempts to keep them seated. The bandleader stared fixedly at his keyboard, refusing to make eye contact with his boss. Take our recent guest, for example, Jimmy continued, his professional mask slipping again. Here's someone who's been handed opportunity after opportunity, who's been elevated by this industry, by shows like mine, that give them a platform. And how do they repay that generosity? By coming here with an attitude, looking for problems where none exist. Backstage, more crew members had gathered around the monitors. A longtime camera operator shook his head. 20 years I've worked this show. Never seen him this vindictive on air. Jimmy seemed unable to stop himself now, his monologue becoming increasingly personal. You want to know the truth about actors like Bella Ramsey? They're so focused on their image, on being seen as serious artists, that they've forgotten the first rule of this business. Be grateful. Be grateful for the opportunities. Be grateful for the platform. Be grateful that people like me are willing to have you on our shows. The problem with being woke, Jimmy continued, practically spitting the last word, is that you become so sensitive to imagined slights that you can't participate in normal human interaction. Everything becomes an attack. Every joke becomes an insult. Every question becomes an interrogation. It's exhausting, and frankly, it's killing comedy. The audience was no longer even pretending to be engaged. Several more had left, and those remaining seemed to be staying more out of morbid curiosity than support. The warmth that typically characterized the show had been replaced by something cold and ugly. You know what? I'm glad they walked off, Jimmy declared, his voice rising, because it showed everyone watching exactly what we're dealing with. This entitled attitude, this holier-than-thou positioning, this constant victimhood. I've been doing this show for years, bringing joy to millions, and I won't be lectured by someone who thinks they're too good for the format that made them famous. The camera operators were visibly uncomfortable now, one of them slightly adjusting, his shot to capture less of Jimmy's increasingly manic gestures. In the control booth, the director had his head in his hands, while the network liaison shouted into multiple phones simultaneously. You want to know what really happened here tonight? Jimmy leaned into the camera, his eyes wild. A spoiled child threw a tantrum because they couldn't handle a little harmless ribbing. That's the headline. That's your story. Not some brave stand against oppression, just another entitled celebrity who thinks they're too important to laugh at themselves. His voice was getting higher, more strained as he continued his tirade. I've interviewed presidents, movie stars, musicians who've sold millions of albums. They all understood the game. They all knew how to take a joke, how to give as good as they got. But not this generation. Oh no, they need safe spaces and trigger warnings and everyone to walk on eggshells around their delicate sensibilities. The band leader was frantically gesturing to the director, pointing at his watch, trying to signal that they needed to wrap the show. But Jimmy was too far gone to notice, too consumed by his own rage to care about television protocol. And you know what the real tragedy is. Jimmy's voice cracked slightly as he leaned forward, gripping the desk. We're raising a generation of artists who can't handle criticism, who can't laugh at themselves, who think every interaction is some kind of microaggression. How are they going to survive in the real world when mommy and daddy and their agents aren't there to protect them from every uncomfortable moment? Finally, mercifully, the band leader made an executive decision and struck up the closing theme. Jimmy looked surprised, then furious, but the music continued. He stood abruptly, his chair spinning behind him, and pointed at the band leader with genuine rage in his eyes. "Don't you dare!" he shouted over the music, his voice barely audible as the audio team had already begun cutting his microphone levels. "I'm not finished. I'm not finished talking about this spoiled brat who thinks they can come on my show and disrespect me." But the credits were already rolling, and the audience was being ushered out by increasingly frantic production assistants. Jimmy remained standing at his desk, gesticulating wildly at cameras that were no longer recording him, his mouth moving in silent fury as his audio was completely cut. Backstage, Bella turned away from the monitors, unable to watch anymore. Around them, crew members began to applaud, first one, then another, until the narrow hallway was filled with the sound. These were the people who had worked under Jimmy for years, who had seen his behavior behind the scenes, who had watched him berate guests and staff alike when the cameras weren't rolling. "Thank you," one of the makeup artists said, tears in her eyes. Someone needed to stand up to him. "He made my assistant quit last month after he screamed at her for 40 minutes about his foundation being too dark." More stories began pouring out from the crew, creating a chorus of long, suppressed grievances. The lighting technician talked about Jimmy's infamous pre-show ritual of finding someone to humiliate to get himself energized. The sound engineer mentioned the countless times they'd had to edit out Jimmy's crueler comments in post-production. "He's coming!" someone whispered urgently, and the gathered crowd quickly dispersed, leaving only Bella and their publicist in the hallway. Jimmy rounded the corner like a storm, his face contorted with rage. He stopped short when he saw Bella, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger. "You think you've won something here? You think this little stunt makes you some kind of hero?" Bella met his gaze steadily. "I think you showed everyone exactly who you are tonight, Jimmy. I didn't have to do anything but refuse to play along." "You've destroyed yourself," Jimmy spat. "I've been in this business since before you were born. I have connections you can't even imagine. You'll never work in this town again." "Maybe," Bella replied calmly, "but at least I'll be able to sleep tonight knowing I didn't compromise my values for your entertainment." Jimmy's face went from red to purple, his whole body trembling with barely contained fury. For a moment, it looked like he might actually lunge at them. But then network executives appeared, flanking him like handlers approaching a dangerous animal. "Jimmy, we need to talk," one of them said firmly, grabbing his arm. "Now." As they led him away, Jimmy turned back in more time, his voice a harsh whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "This isn't over. Not even close." If you enjoyed this deep dive into what happens when someone finally stands up to a bully in Hollywood, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Do you think more celebrities should push back against disrespectful treatment, or should they just grin and bear it for the sake of their careers?